It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Newton Siele. Still a doctoral student, so not yet a doctor, but it's an honor to be here. I'm currently serving as the CEO at PHILLIPS, actually for the Pharma Division and also the medical devices. Now, I noted the theme that I was tasked by Dr. Lucy, and I wanted to deviate just a little bit because I'm going to explain why and where I'm coming from. Our theme is curbing the burden of counterfeits and substandard health products and technologies, and really just looking at a health systems approach. But I also thought, what better way, because from where I come from myself, we tend to talk a lot more of our strength as one of the oldest distributors in the country, that is as PHILLIPS, and that is in supply chain. And I believe that when you address supply chain in its entirety, you're really also able to sort of unpack that topic on how we can be able to curb the burden of counterfeits. And in essence, what I'm saying is that if we have a much more streamlined supply chain, it really would also be one of the ways that we can reduce the risk of substandard products. And I want to give you a bit of a historical insight on how we ourselves look at improving this. And I believe it will answer some of the components that maybe the other speakers will be talking about as they come in. What are we facing in terms of the challenges and how we adopting? I think it's interesting because at PHILLIPS, and I believe a lot of my peers today are also taking advantage of technology. And I believe this is one of the things that's going to be able to help us to really address the risk of counterfeits, but also just more integrity within the system that we have, the supply chain system. Today, any patient that walks in to a pharmacy, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a retail pharmacy, whether it's a community pharmacy, most of the people hardly get to know where the product has come from. And we hope that as we shift that focus, we can also have the generation that's going to be asking not just what they have been given or dispensed, but how this product arrive. And I believe one of those things will also be addressed on my topic. Most of you are familiar with the supply chain process, so I know I'm also preaching to the choir. I do not need to be able to tell you as experts. We work with manufacturers at PHILLIPS. In my last count, we had about 78 different manufacturers that we work with. Personally, I manage about 38 of them. And what has happened over the years for us is that the reason why they tend to come to us as PHILLIPS is because they trust the process with which we work with them to ensure that the product leaves the manufacturer, but really is ensured that at the end of that particular chain, the patient is able to get that product within the same standard that the manufacturer had been able to start with. And I believe that's also important because that's also one of the topics that we'll be talking about today. What we have seen is that there are two aspects. When we talk about our theme in terms of curbing the threats that we have, both for counterfeit and substandard products, we see that the loopholes also do happen in terms of supply chain. Now, maybe to digress a little bit is just to say, what are some of the challenges that we have faced ourselves? There's been an increase in shipping costs. And by the way, one of the things that people tend to argue when it comes to counterfeits and substandards is that they're much more cost effective. But we tell people that there's, of course, a risk that you pay for something that may seem to be slightly cheaper. But one thing that we can be able to guarantee is that we have effective internal and external processes. We are able to navigate the supply chain complexity, and we're able to ensure that at the end, when we plan or when we forecast, we ensure that the patients are able to get the drugs in adequate volumes. One of the things that happens, especially if you note with substandard products and counterfeits, is that often they're not even able to meet the demand. And of course, usually, and maybe I'm a bit biased when I talk about PIs, but for us, I think from where we sit is that we would like to be measured with the same yardstick. Why is that the case? Because we are using technology. We are ensuring, as I said, that from the time the product leaves the manufacturer, the same quality and standards is what is also going to be received by the final patient when the prescription is dispensed. And that is really important. What are some of the things that the technology has helped us from a supply chain perspective? You can see there, there's of course reduction in the workload. Better technology has meant, of course, that we have better supply chain management. And so usually when we sit down with Pharmacy and Poisons Board, we say that over time we're able to predict. I work in a number of therapy areas, and we can be able to tell that, look, if we have patients, for example, in diabetes, we supply insulin and we supply Kemsa, for example. We know that they have 50,000 patients currently on treatment. I can be able to sort of guarantee you, because of technology, that these patients will never need to go out of stock unless you go out of money and you can't pay me, which is different. But again, it's purely based on planning that is data-driven. We're able to not just forecast, but plan, work with the supplier, ensure that should there be any hiccups or anticipated supply chain challenges, we're able to factor that in across the chain so that eventually, of course, the patient is also able to get their treatments. And this has worked. At Philips, we do not compromise in terms of quality. That's one of the photos of our warehouse. We're happy that we have also partnered with, I would say, international organizations, and these ones have very high standards. We work with USAID, we work with Chemonics, we represent some of the biggest multinationals like Johnson & Johnson, we've worked with Abbott, and as a result, the systems that we have in place do ensure, and I would say give comfort to the person that is buying the product. And if I may just go back to what I was saying earlier with supply chain, especially for cold chain products, for us, that integrity is important. What are some of the things that tend to be risked with counterfeits and substandard products is that they cannot be able to even guarantee that integrity of the cold chain. And usually you will find that when they are then asked if they can be able to account for how the product was transported, it becomes a challenge. One time about 2 years ago, we had somebody who was importing insulin, and a patient literally went, they actually based here in Gara, to buy one of the products, and I believe it was a flex pen, and it was completely frozen. I remember we went to the Pharmacy and Poisons Board and we were asking, how is this meant to help the patient? You know, and those are some of the risks, as I said, that you tend to have, especially when it comes to this unscrupulous traders. We call them merchants of death from where I come from. And as I said, I have seen this for a while within our industry. Yes, I think supply chain is one of the health systems that is going to enable us to be able to ensure that we can manage this. Obviously, there's a lot that needs to be done from the policy perspective, and maybe this is a lot more in terms of just the implementation, because the policy has been there. What we feel is a challenge from where we sit is the implementation of that policy. I want to talk about two things before I come back to the topic, so allow me again to digress and go back to technology. Why is it important, and how does this fill in, as I said, within that ecosystem of ensuring that by optimizing on technology, we're also curbing that burden? For us, it's that ability to be able to track the products from the time that they leave the manufacturer. That way I can be able to guarantee you, as I said, what you're buying or eventually what the patient is getting. The rest of the metrics, as you can see, like inventory turnover, order cycle time, perfect order rate, these are things that of course we would use, but for us it sort of ensures that we are planning to make sure that there's availability. Why? Because we've seen some of the traders that are unscrupulous try and use the excuse that we can't be able to fill a gap that is in the market. And that's never really a gap, especially when what you're bringing into the market is counterfeit or substandard products. That way, I would say, with things like predictive analytics, we are able to work and understand what is currently required in the market. What we have seen is, of course, the people that tend to try and come in, as I said, merchants of death, try to use a very similar analogy by saying that this is a fast-moving product, so I can be able to go somewhere, sort of purport to be able to procure it at a much more lower cost. I'll probably apply for a parallel import and bring it in. But it's really not, I would say, a genuine business, and there's a significant risk. One of the things that we saw, and I'm saying we learned this especially post-COVID-19, is that people really wanted to know, for example, where the product was and when they could be able to get it. And most of you remember the challenges that we went through. And as I said, if you look at the loopholes that came, I also believe that in as much as we had in Kenya the history of the COVID millionaires, COVID billionaires or millionaires? COVID millionaires, I believe. People took advantage, and some did use that opportunity to supply substandard products. And what we are saying is that when you have a system that is fully functional, you can be able to actually track and monitor those shipments. I wasn't involved, for example, in remdesivir. I'm sure some of you who are working at that particular time, you must have been bombarded with requests. And, eventually one of the things that we were discussing with some of my friends at the Pharmacy and Poisons Board is there was a time that you could not even be able to verify what's exactly that remdesivir that somebody is selling to you. Where is it coming from? There wasn't any opportunity to track and trace. And of course, as I said, in a calamity or a crisis as we had in COVID-19, we may have lost people because they also got substandard products. My point I'm trying to say is that health systems work also when we have that integrity and the ability to monitor. And maybe it's one of the things that we would like people to be asking. One of the benefits that we have also seen when it comes to technology, and as I said, I'm sort of navigating between that and the supply chain, is that ability to be able to also analyze supplier performance and improve the quality and timelines of deliveries. For me, this is important because every time there's a loophole in the system where there's either an out of stock unavailability or drugs that cannot be found, for example, we've seen unscrupulous traders take advantage. And most of you have seen products that, for one reason or another, either the manufacturers themselves decide to diversify and remove the products from the market. We've had companies, even for us in PHILLIPS, one of which was supplying very important psychiatry products, just decide to pull out of Africa, not just Kenya. And what we have seen as a risk of that is that the traders then take advantage of this particular scenario to say that I can be able to source the same product, and God knows where they are sourcing these products from. But to imagine that a patient somewhere would actually be using that is in itself a risk. What's my point? That we've seen in our adoption of technology and data, and we've been trying to convince the health authorities that, you know what, you can use the same data. After all, PPB is one of the few organizations, regulatory, that has really very high adoption in terms of data and analytics. How can you use it to improve the safety of what the patients are getting? How do we talk about a health systems approach when we do not really take this advantage? I want to give you one scenario, and this is just on the parallel imports, just to sort of put into context one of the areas where we've seen as a risk. And I'll contextualize it in 3 problems. As I said, parallel importation is legal in Kenya. There is actually a law legislation to that effect. However, the unfortunate thing is that it's usually not followed. Number one, we do have people that import uncompliant products. When I say uncompliant products, the language that even the products come in are not what is mandated by the regulator, which is English and Kiswahili. And so, of course, it's puzzling how these products get into the counters when they are either in Turkish completely, even the patient insert or the patient leaflet is in a different language. So that in itself is one problem that we face. But of course, problem number 2 is the fact that somehow the system seems to have a loophole. Because if the product has already landed in the country and there was an import permit that was applied, that was approved, and it is actually in the shelf, how did it pass through all those checks and balances? The product, as I said, may have been cleared also through one of our border systems, whether it came in by air or any other means. It must have been cleared by somebody who is authorized. How did they miss out that this product? And I think from where we sit, our question and our challenge always has been, how can we then be able to curb this when there are loopholes in the systems that have not been addressed? And of course, I would say the much more bigger problem is that the public then is at risk, because when it comes to the ability for these players or these traders, as we call them merchants, to then roll out a proper pharmacovigilance, that's the one area where they draw the line. As Kenyans say, saa zingine unasema ndio ikutoke, si ndio? But that's a challenge that we face. And I say that not even as a distributor myself, but as somebody whose mother is on antihypertensives. I want to be sure that when she goes and buys that particular antihypertensive at the pharmacy, she's able to know where the drug is from, because she's relying on that to be able to control her blood pressure, or whatever it is, medication that somebody is taking. I think that is important. So I want to also thank the team at APN really for sort of putting in this topic, because from where I sit, we see firsthand the challenges that we face. And as I said, as distributors, we do partner, of course, with our peers through CAPI, for example. We do work very closely with PSK, we work very closely with the Farmtechs, we do work very closely with the regulator. I think it's important for us not just to see this as a topic that we address at this particular dinner, but to challenge ourselves and ask, what are we doing? What is your role as a young pharmacist in making sure that we really contribute towards curbing these counterfeits and substandard products? Because you may have the knowledge, you may have the expertise, but what about that person that is buying a product in Kisumu, in Nyalenda, in Kericho, or in Taita Taveta? Who protects them? And I think that's a very important question for us to ask ourselves. And I hope, even as I conclude on my brief talk, that I'm convincing you from where we sit as one of the leading distributors in the country, we see technology as being a way in which we can be able to help in curbing this burden of counterfeits and substandards. Our role is to make sure that we can be able to guarantee the supply chain, so that if you ask me, Newton, I want to know where the product came from, I can be able to tell you that. If you ask me that I want to see the analysis for these products, I can be able to tell you that. If you ask me that, is this as per the registration that you have submitted or the market authorizations, I can be able to tell you that. And that same challenge should also be posed to anybody that is out there, so that together we make sure that we have a health system that works for all of us. I think that's important. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Newton, for that very insightful presentation. I'm going to open it up for questions from the floor, if there are any, before we allow Newton to say. Any questions that you need? Thank you. When you're asking a question, please introduce yourself and then go ahead and ask the question. Thank
you. Yeah, good evening. It's not really a question, but a comment that can be answered by anybody. My name is Boniface Kamiti. I work at the Competition Authority of Kenya in Consumer Protection. And we've done a lot of work on consumer protection also in the pharmaceutical industry, but what I would like to ask Newton, because you are one of the major players in the economy, is that what are you doing? You talked about partnership, but what basically are you doing to really address this issue of the parallel imports? I know there are aspects where governments need to come in. Have you made a great effort to push your case to ensure that you to address some of these issues?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'd like to give a real life case. Last year, but one, we had one of the products that we do import is antiretrovirals. There's one called Truvada, because we represent Gilead, which is one of the leading companies in providing HIV treatments. And we picked out in the market that there was a product that wasn't what we had imported. So as per protocol, we notified the regulator, and then we also notified the manufacturer. Fortunately, the manufacturer was quite proactive, and they insisted that they want to see the product, they want to be able to test it, and they want to get more information. So subsequently, we then set up a number of meetings involving the regulator. We sent the samples for analysis, and sadly, the product actually wasn't a genuine product. And we worked very closely with the regulator. We got very good support from the manufacturer. Eventually, they did a public announcement, and that particular batch was highlighted. And I think the point for me here is that it's not always that you get very supportive, because some of the manufacturers get frustrated by the systems, that sometimes it really drags along. But in this case, of course, when you look at something that is as sensitive as antiretrovirals, it's important, because, as I said, it could be anybody. In this case, it's a product that is used for PrEP, and somebody is using it to prevent the risk of getting HIV. So I do think that it's important, as not just as distributors, but all the players within the ecosystem, to really work together. And in this one, as I said, I do give a thumbs up really to the regulator because they were very fast and they really supported the process. It's not always the case. I think we've had instances where, as I said, business people are also very unscrupulous, and sometimes they have found ways of trying to maneuver. For us, we believe that in the end, it's the welfare of the patient that comes first. And as I said, I give myself as an example. My own mother is buying antihypertensives. I just want to be sure that what she's getting is the genuine product.
Thank you very much, Newton. I think what I'm hearing as well is that we each have a part to play, right? From the patient side to the distributor to the manufacturer, as we learn as well as we go along tonight. We each have a part to play. We can never be too helpless to be able to address the issue of counterfeit and substandard products. I'll take 2 more questions and then we'll proceed to the next part. So let me see. And now I have the full view of the room. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll get the mic to you. Going once. Going twice. Newton, I have a question.
I was about to say, okay.
So, where does the patient stand in this conversation, right? So we are all here as professionals, but what are some of the initiatives that you as distributors, for example, in the supply chain have put in place to empower patients or clients to be able to come forward with concerns around substandard drugs?
Again, I probably want to reference one of my previous experiences as a product manager in oncology, and at that time I was working with Roche. We did realize that there was, a likelihood that some substandard products, which were actually chemotherapies for oncology, was finding its way into the market. In this instance, one of the things that we did was to work with the regulator again, get approvals to do the posters so that we could put up these posters in the chemotherapy centers, or at least where the patients were, and doing things like patient flyers and leaflets. Is it completely foolproof in terms of its outcome? Maybe not, but I think it did help. And I'm happy to say, even when I do see in some of the hospitals, they still have these posters. I think for me, and maybe to our guests from the Competitions Authority, I think there's a lot more work, because usually the person that is ignored the most is the patient. And the patient is not a professional. The patient trusts the person at the counter. The patient trusts the person in the lab coat. And we know that, of course, not everybody in a white lab coat is a professional. And that in itself is also a challenge. Yeah.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I found incredibly useful is, so my mom is diabetic, right? And so one time she calls me and says, oh, I'm seeing some weird thing on my package this time round, okay? And it was a cereal that allows her to actually be able to check if the product is genuine, right? And so when she sent me the picture, I was like, okay, this is interesting. But when I think about a patient who is helpless, like you said, is trusting the person across the counter. And my challenge to us is, what can we consistently do, right, as the professionals in this field, to make sure that that innocent client is empowered to actually be able to, first of all, identify the product if it's substandard, right? And also, do they know the channels through which we can report it, okay? Both, not just from a manufacturer point of view, but also I think one of the things we can collaborate around is the supply chain. How are we empowering the client to be able to do this? So, thank you very much, Newton.
Thank you.